Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making this video as a direct sequel to my Ramadan 2011 Some Thoughts video. I found some additional information that has a direct link to what I was talking about in that video. I saw in the New York Times, I have it here, this article called The Rise of Macro-Nationalists. And it's a short article. I wanted to read this to you, because it talks about the situation with Anders Breivik, and it also raises some questions and some points that a user left a comment on my video saying, you know, that it may not be a right characterization to call Anders Breivik, who was the terrorist who killed the innocent people in Oslo, to call him a Christian fundamentalist, because in the eyes of this individual, you know, he was not a deeply religious Christian, so it would be unfair to call him that. And I responded in the comment section to some of the to that point, and I won't regurgitate that here. But this article and some other pieces of information I want to bring to the table discusses that subject. So let me read this article to you all. It says, at first glance, the 1,500-page manifesto of Anders Breivik, the man accused of the terrorist attacks in Oslo, appears to be a fairly standard ideological treatise of the far right. The document, which Mr. Breivik posted online on July 22nd, just hours before the attacks, in which he titled 2083, A European Declaration of Independence, evokes several of the movement's central themes and cites numerous right-wing ideologues. On closer inspection, however, Mr. Breivik's worldview does not fit squarely into any of the established categories of right-wing ideology like white supremacism, ultranationalism, or Christian fundamentalism. Rather, it reveals a new doctrine of civilizational war that represents the closest thing yet to a Christian version of Al-Qaeda. For example, although Mr. Breivik says he fears the extinction of the Norwegian genotypes, racial hygiene is not high on his agenda. He wants to expel, not kill, Muslims in Europe, and he does not mind Jews and non-Muslim Asians. Similarly, while Mr. Breivik says he is extremely proud of his Odinistic Norse heritage, he is not a Norwegian nationalist. His Declaration of Independence applies to all of Europe. And while he is a Christian, he admits that I'm not going to pretend I'm a very religious person. Instead, Mr. Breivik's goal is to reverse what he views as the Islamization of Western Europe. Indeed, he sees himself as a soldier in a defensive war against Islamic imperialism. In his view, Muslims are colonizing Europe, helped by high birth rates and a doctrine of multiculturalism advocated by the European elite. Islam for him represents an existential threat to European civilization, a threat that must be countered at all costs. The best way to do so, he argues, is to wage war against cultural Marxists, his label for the European political and intellectual elite, because they are the traitors who allow the colonization to take place. While Mr. Breivik's violent acts are exceptional, his anti-Islamic views are not. Much, though not all, of Mr. Breivik's manifesto is inspired by a relatively new right-wing intellectual current, often referred to as counter-jihad. The movement's roots go back to the 1980s, but it gained substantial momentum only after 9/11. Its main home is the internet, where blogs like Jihad Watch, Atlas Shrugs, and Gates of Vienna publish essays by writers like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Batyor, and Furgerman, a pseudonym for a Norwegian blogger. Mr. Breivik's manifesto is replete with citations of counter-jihad writers, strongly suggesting that he was inspired by them. Of course, by advocating the mass murder of European politicians, Mr. Breivik goes much further than any counter-jihad ideologue has ever done, and his manifesto contains ideas and information that have no precedent in the counter-jihad literature. For example, he provides extensive advice on how to build bombs and plan terrorist attacks. The leading counter-jihad writers have virtually never advocated violence, and several of them have condemned Mr. Breivik's actions. He also claims to be a member of a knightly order called the European Military Order and Criminal Tribunal, which he describes as a reincarnation of the Knights Templar, and which he says he founded in London in 2002 with activists from 8 countries across Europe. Indeed, the more belligerent part of Mr. Breivik's ideology has less in common with counter-jihad with its arch-enemy, Al-Qaeda. Both Mr. Breivik and Al-Qaeda see themselves as engaged in a civilizational battle between Islam and the West that extends back to the Crusades. Both fight on behalf of the transnational entities, the Ummah, or community of all Muslims in the case of the Al-Qaeda, and Europe in the case of Mr. Breivik. Both frame their struggle as defensive wars of survival. Both hate their respective governments for collaborating with the outside enemy. Both use the language of martyrdom. Mr. Breivik calls his attack a martyrdom operation. Both call themselves knights and espouse the medieval idea of chivalry. Both lament the erosion of patriarchy and the emancipation of women. Of course, these similarities should not be taken to mean that Mr. Breivik is inspired by or emulates Al-Qaeda. Rather, they suggest that Mr. Breivik and Al-Qaeda are manifestations of the same generic ideological phenomenon, macro-nationalism, a variant of nationalism applied to clusters of nation-states held together by the notion of shared identity like the West, quote-unquote, or Ummah. Extreme macro-nationalists view their people as under attack and fight in their defense. In the Muslim world, so-called pan-Islamism has a long history and has inspired militancy since at least the 1980s, when Arabs traveled to Afghanistan to fight with fellow Muslims against Soviet occupation. The West has long lacked similar movements, but the rise of counter-jihad in the 2000s and the appearance of the Breivik Manifesto suggests that this may be changing. If a violent anti-Muslim movement does emerge in the West, we can expect it to be divided on the question of who its target should be, just as jihadis have been. Some will prefer to punish the European elite for their treason, as Mr. Breivik did. Others will attack Muslims directly, as did the sniper who killed and injured several immigrants in Malmö, Sweden last year. Countering extreme macro-nationalists like Al-Qaeda and Anders Breivik is difficult because the causes they espouse often enjoy a certain popular support even if their prescription, mass murder, is almost universally rejected. Just as Al-Qaeda exploited widespread Muslim opposition to American policies in the Middle East, so does Mr. Breivik tap into a relatively large reservoir of anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe. We can only hope that Mr. Breivik's actions will be seen as so horrific that they undermine his cause. One Qaeda is more than enough. And that's the end of that article. That article was in the New York Times, written by Thomas Heeghammer. It was in the opinions column. Another interesting thing is people, Richard the Dick Coughlin did a video where he refuted this notion of Eurabia, which I think I linked that in my original video. But just to refute it in an even larger fashion, they have a poll, they have a graph here showing immigration to Norway. Now, this isn't all of Europe. This is just Norway. But again, part of his manifesto is this idea that Muslims are taking over. And what's interesting is that this is this is immigrants just in 2010. This is just last year, and the majority of 68% of them were from other European countries. I'm going to hold this up here. That is what you see. That's the breakdown, and that is just last year. So this idea that immigrants, that Muslims are taking over via immigration, again, this graph here, this is from the source for this is from Statistics Norway. So again, the article is really enlightening because so the user who commented on my video in a way had a point. He was not a deeply religious Christian fundamentalist, in as such that, by his own admission in the article, he says, I'm not going to pretend that I'm very religious. However, he belongs to a group that's the reincarnation of a Knights Templar. His PowerPoint presentation, which was on YouTube, I believe, depicts strong symbolism and respect for the heritage of militant medieval Christians. And so, again, I'm not saying that he went to church every Sunday, but as I noted in my previous video, the fact that he shows inspiration from these sources, which many of them are Christian in essence, is extremely important to understand. Now, another point I want to make in this video is I'm going to link these articles in the more info section for you to read for yourself. They're all from Loonwatch, but it is people's reactions to Breivik. I mentioned in my previous video that there are people who are endorsing this guy. Now, what's fascinating is Richard Dick Coughlin and a number of other, and Loonwatch themselves, have posted a number of articles where Pamela Geller, who many people are now accusing of knowing the identity of the Norwegian terrorists, of Anders Breivik, or at least knew that there was going to be a potential attack in Norway, but covered it up, or didn't say anything as well. Her reaction, according to Loonwatch now, is quite what I was anticipating, which was these conservatives, instead of doing introspection, which I mentioned in my previous video, which would have been the rational thing to do, to realize that, oh crap, this crazy man has taken our words as inspiration and has done these terrible deeds and has written this huge manifesto. Instead of doing that, they are now projecting. They're repressing. They're trying to sweep all this under the rug, and now they're projecting their anger onto none other but the victims of the terrorist attack. That's right, Pamela Geller and Glenn Beck have issued statements basically saying, in essence, that the teenagers, the children that were slaughtered by this man, pretty much had it coming. Loon Watch has the full coverage in a number of about 3 articles that I will link just on Pamela Geller's statements, which are essentially racist in nature, because in one case, she tried to cover this up, but on her website, she had a photo of some of the teens that were at this camp, and in the caption, she noted that some of the kids in the photo didn't appear, in her estimation, to be pure Norwegians, and seemed to be a mixed group. So she is definitely hit rock bottom with regards to, instead of accepting some sort of responsibility, or at least reflecting on this issue that the person was inspired by her and other people like Robert Spencer, she instead decides to go and attack the victims, the innocent people that were killed because of this lunatic. Another person, which I'll leave as another article from Loon Watch, and I'll leave it in the description section, is Debbie Schulzel, who is also championing this idea that the victims had it coming. The article, which I will just read, the title, she says, Oslo victims were terrorists, not victims. Their deaths was karma. Child victims were bitches. Quote unquote. That is the article's title. And I know that's pretty inflammatory, but they show that this woman essentially is saying that they had it coming, that they essentially, because of their political, because it was a youth political camp, they essentially, she has no remorse for them. She thinks they deserved it. She doesn't believe in mourning for them, and basically thinks that their families now know what it feels like for others to, essentially experience the attacks from a terrorist. Just mind-boggling stuff. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. When you have people who, instead of reflecting on the situation, trying to, in a reasonable fashion, figure out why this took place, the unimaginable happens. I mean, Freud and Jung would be proud of this, not of course of the situation, but of the this example of negative projection. I mean, no, and also one more link I'll leave is Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. Loon Watch has a 5-minute clip from his show where he shows Fox News' hypocrisy about, how quick the media was, the mainstream media was so quick to call Anders Breivik a Christian, when they were so quick to call the attacks, they were like, oh, it's a Muslim who did it. I mean, what a bunch of damn hypocrites. It's like, before the dust settled, they had already painted the attacks as Islamic, or Muslim perpetrators had done it, and now the tables are turned. And they're like, no, don't. See, this is what I'm talking about. These are great examples of utter projection, and instead of caring about the victims, and as Jon Stewart points out, they're more concerned about covering their own butts. And instead of just deflating, as opposed to doing the reasonable thing, which is to contemplate the situation, try and understand it on a reasonable level, and to reflect on the guys in Breivik's inspirations. Sure, I can't say, and as Bill O'Reilly says in some of the clips that Jon Stewart shows, I can't show that Breivik was a Bible-beating, Christian who went to church every Sunday. But who inspired him? Like I said in my comments, I think it's very clear who inspired him. Whether he called himself a cultural Christian or what have you, he was inspired by something that, of course, does not represent the majority of Christians. I would never argue that. But he's definitely taken organizations and groups and historical situations in Christian and European history and has brought it to the 21st century and is attempting to use it. And as Richard the Decathlonist said, as this article from the New York Times says, extremists and other extremists, they feed off of each other. And we peaceful, loving people, we non-crazy ideologues, are stuck in the middle. So I hope we can read all this information, educate ourselves, and attempt to be reflective instead of projecting. Thank you everyone for watching. Peace be with you all.